Okay, so I'm going to be giving the next presentation on a project that we've worked on for a few years now, funded by the HRC, looking at the impact of child poverty in New Zealand on health. This is work done with a team, myself, Nicola, who did most of the work I'm going to present today, Cherie Gibb at University of Otago, Wellington, as is Amanda Kvalsvig and Michael Baker. Beck Bentley and Tony Blakely in Melbourne. You would have been hearing a lot from Tony recently on the outbreak of COVID in Melbourne, and actually from Michael on the outbreak of COVID in New Zealand. Andrew Spall, who tells me he's going to pop in sometime today, and Eileen, who's just sitting over there. Okay, so child poverty has become a bigger issue in New Zealand, I think leading into the current government, and certainly in the current government. Latest estimates, these estimates published in 2019 from 2018 from the New Zealand Poverty Monitor, suggest there are around 250,000 children living in severe income poverty. That's less than 50% of the median household income. And the suggestion is, if you read that report, that the prevalence hasn't really changed over the past 12 years. Use a different measure, and these tend to be the two that people use, kind of a material hardship deprivation measure or a relative income measure. The figure's about 150,000, with perhaps a suggested a recent decline over the last few years. They don't have as many years of data for that one. The interesting thing about New Zealand, though, is that poverty is concentrated in childhood. The childhood poverty rate in New Zealand is 1.6 times larger than the poverty rate of the general population. If you were to plot New Zealand on a graph of otherwise European countries, on the extent to which child poverty is dominant over poverty in other stages of lifetime, New Zealand rates at the top. That's that 1.6 mark there. The closest to them is the 1.4. Okay, so we do a really good job of reducing elder age poverty and poverty in other parts and other age groups, but poorest job of reducing childhood poverty in New Zealand. In terms of poverty and health, most of the ways that this has been looked at are not directly looking at poverty. And if you look at the data from New Zealand, and it's again from the Child Poverty Monitor, they look at health outcomes as a function of deprivation or something else, New Zealand Deprivation Index, so area level deprivation or something else. And you see, especially in the right-hand panel there, it's probably most clear. Well, actually, no, on the left-hand panel, you see that the different lines, although there may be change over time, the different lines are separated out, and they're lines based on quintile of NZ deprivation. So the most deprived tend to have the most hospitalizations, and that's broken out by hospitalization type on the right-hand side, which you probably can't read, but respiratory infections, skin conditions, nervous conditions, etc. However, if we want to act on poverty and hope that it has an impact on health, we need evidence that is causally related to health outcomes. And the evidence for that internationally is more mixed. In a systematic review, they did two, but the most recent one by Kuber and Stewart, published in 2017, they found that there are effects on birth weight and other early child outcomes, mixed evidence for the impact on obesity and general health later in life, and no evidence for effects on respiratory conditions such as asthma and wheezing and other respiratory diseases. So we thought what we would like to do is a couple of things. We would like to investigate child poverty in New Zealand and quantify the extent to which income poverty is associated with later health outcomes. I'll say a little bit how we also looked at deprivation, but in our conception of things, deprivation is on the mediating pathway between having low income and later outcomes such as health. So we wanted to see what the effect was of child poverty on health and for which health outcomes, and whether there's evidence of a causal association. There's also debate about the issue of poverty dynamics, when the poverty is experienced and how long it goes on for, and whether that has an impact on health outcomes. But the main thing we're interested in doing, actually, and I'll explain why we haven't quite gotten on, well, don't look like we're going to get onto that, is look at the extent to which particular factors are able to mediate the association between child poverty and health, because we reason that it's very, very difficult to change society to reduce poverty. That should be a goal, but it's difficult to do and it may take time. In the meantime, it may be that there are factors on the pathway between poverty and health, such that if you were to intervene on them, you can reduce the health or improve the health by reducing the health impacts that children are experiencing through poverty. And at the same time as we were thinking this, we wanted to make use of the IDI, which was relatively new at the time when we were planning this, which was in 2016, make use of the linked administrative data to assess health outcomes for a longitudinal cohort. In the integrated data infrastructure is the Survey of Families, Income and Employment, which isn't running now, but it did run for 8 waves in the early 2000s. And that enables you to, amongst other things, assess household poverty for families that contain children. And for those children, you can link to their health records, which is what we plan to do. Just briefly, and this will be the first one time of many you'll be seeing a slide like this coming up, but this is just the IDI. That explains what the IDI is, which is a person-level linking of administrative data sets made available for research in an anonymized fashion. That disclaimer, written in very small print, basically says that what I'm about to tell you is our results, not Stats New Zealand's, they're not official statistics. And the bottom bit says we use tax data for this as well, more or less. Okay, so in investigating the IDI for what we could possibly look at for health outcomes for children that were purported to be poverty sensitive, we homed in on outcomes for hospitalizations. And one of the reasons we were limited to hospitalizations is the other health data that does exist wasn't really available during the years that the SOPHI dataset was running. So if you're looking at pharmaceutical use, for instance, that really doesn't get good until towards the end of the period, so the 2007 mark. And we wouldn't have the longitudinal run in there to do a causal analysis, which I'll get onto in a few slides' time. So, speaking with Michael Baker and Amanda Kvalsvig, preparing the application, we thought, well, what are the sort of things that are poverty sensitive that we could look at in the hospitalization area? And we decided we'd look at various types of hospitalization, some of which, the definitions of which overlap with each other, but they're listed there: preventable hospitalization, respiratory hospitalizations, hospitalizations for infectious diseases, hospitalizations for oral health conditions, and hospitalizations for otitis media. What we're showing, as well as hospitalizations for anything. And what you see there across the waves of SOPHI with the numbers of children we're able to assess across those different waves, the prevalence of those conditions over time. Okay, so jumping straight ahead to what we did. What we wanted to see was whether income poverty, defined as being less than 60% of the median income, although we did also do investigation of less than 50% of the median income and basically got the same results, and also did various other things that I'm going to explain to you, whether there was an association between those conditions, between that experience and having those hospitalization conditions. And the results are shown there for a before housing cost measure of poverty and a poverty measure after you take out the housing costs and also after you take out the tax that people paid. So it's more a disposable income measure. And to our surprise, the associations were a lot weaker than we were expecting. Sort of risk ratios around the 1.1 to 1.3 mark before housing costs, and slightly bigger after housing costs, but still not that big. So if I was to hone in, for instance, on the all hospitalization figure there, that's a difference of 1 hospitalization, give or take, 0.95. And what that suggests, or 1% in hospitalizations, what that suggests is you'd have to prevent 100 poverty cases, or change them from being in poverty to not being in poverty, assuming it was causal, in order to prevent 1 hospitalization. So quite a small effect. I don't know if I can. I'd love to be able to. Oh, yes, let's see. No, I don't think I can. I can tell you what they are, though. That's 1.23, 1.23, 1.23, and 1.13. My apologies. I can't move the this camera icon on the screen. Okay, so we weren't seeing much in terms of cross-sectional associations. What we wanted to see is whether there was a causal association. That is, what we wanted to look at is whether, if we looked at whether children who moved in and out of poverty status over time, whether that had an impact on their gaining or having a hospitalization in the subsequent year after they moved. And you do this by a fixed effects regression model, which is essentially within person model that takes account of all the factors that are the same within a person, taking account of accounting for all the things that are different between people. So they're not a factor anymore, so you don't have to account for gender and ethnicity, the things that stay the same over time with people. And what we see there is, again, across conditions, there was no evidence using odds ratios here of really any effect at all. All the odds ratios and all the beta coefficients, when we looked at a log of income, look at it as a continuous measure rather than a binary measure, still no evidence there of an association. These analyses are run on a fewer number of children than we started with, because you have to have change in the outcome in order to stay in this analysis. So is it that it's concentrated in particular age stages, and we were focusing on the whole age range and therefore weren't able to detect an association? The effect there is largely no. What I've done is broken down there by age group, sort of the preschool, the primary school, and then the intermediate and secondary school children, and look at association again across those conditions at the cross-sectional level, and you're not seeing much of an association except one for oral health, which is the lowest prevalence condition in the older age group. And you see higher prevalences of those things in the younger age groups, and you get a wide confidence interval there because we've got low numbers in the outcome measure. So really not much going on. Does duration have a factor? So if we don't just look at whether you're in poverty now, but if you spent several waves in poverty, does that have an impact? And again, it seems like it doesn't. What I've showed you there is the number of waves in poverty, 0, 1, or 2. So looking back 2 waves. We see similar things if you add more waves in, by the way, but I'm just showing 2. And where we see detectably significant associations at all, you can't argue that there's a dose-response relationship. If anything, what you're seeing is being in poverty one time is worse for you than being in poverty twice. So no evidence that there's a duration of poverty effect going on here. And this, I think, was one of the most interesting things that we did and Nicola did here. And what we've done here is looked at the association across the full income distribution. With poverty, you make a cut point somewhere, either the 50th percentile or 60th percentile of the median income. What I've got along the bottom of each of those panels is income percentile. And what we've got, the curve showing is the prevalence for those income percentiles for each of those outcomes, based on self-reported income, but also income reported by tax records, which are able to link in from the census. And interesting what you're seeing there, what you would expect to see if there was a poverty effect would be an uptick at the left-hand end. So flat at the right-hand end and then an uptick at the left-hand end as you're at the lowest percentiles of income poverty. You see the opposite. So it seems if anything's going on at all, it's not a poverty effect, it's a wealth effect. If you are beyond us about the 50th or 60th percentile, you have lower rates of these conditions. But there's no evidence of being right at the left-hand end has an uptick in having these conditions. And that is pretty much the same if you look at it across all the conditions. You can kind of see the one that's blocked there on the bottom right-hand side. So yeah, sorry, I already showed the tax records there, but once we used the SOFI income records and recognized that there wasn't much going on, we thought, okay, maybe there's something going on with the SOFI income measure, which adds income from a number of different sources. So we got individuals in the households of the children and accessed their income records from IRD and looked to see whether we construct a poverty measure based on IRD reported income, showed any different association with what we're seeing before. And basically the answer is no. We're still seeing lowish associations there of the same magnitude to what we saw before. Well, is the SOFI data set the problem there? Well, what we did is we went and we accessed the census data that was in there. And what I've got at the top there, and again, sorry that the bottom is blocked a little bit for people in the audience here, is the associations repeated for the SOFI measure for the SOFI sample, and then on the right-hand side for the census sample, using the same measure, but for SOFI we've got the self-reported income from everyone in the household, and census it's reported in bands, and then household income worked out by adding up across the people in the household. And really, apart from the one bolded, they're all overlapping each other. Census may be slightly higher, but not by much. And especially if you look at the bottom panel, where we look at the tax record. So in other words, we've got the census people and we're linking to their tax income. We've got the SOFI people linking to their tax income. The associations are more or less the same. So when you measure poverty in the same way in the census cohort versus this longitudinal SOFI cohort, you're getting the same estimates, roughly, of association. That is not very much. What about another data set? So we're working with people at the University of Melbourne, and they had access to the longitudinal study of Australian children. And what this shows here, maybe you can't read, even if you do turn your head along the bottom there, but they had various measures in the SOFI data set on wheeze, GP visits, hospitalizations, ear infections, and then they actually linked to their equivalent of the health data sets, although they're actually able to link, which you can't do in New Zealand very easily, to GP records. And long story, and those are the ones that are shown in the red. Those are the ones that they linked. Long story short is, regardless of the poverty measure that you use, there's very little evidence of an impact of poverty on these child health outcomes, with the possible exception of ear infections, but again, you can see the wide confidence interval there. That's the one jutting up. So not much really going on with income poverty. So we thought, well, surely there's something going on here. We've seen these associations with deprivation. Can we repeat them? And the answer is yes. I've got different colored lines there for the different conditions in each of the panels there. And on the top panel, I've got the NZ-DEP area measure of deprivation in SOFI and NZ-DEP. And you're pretty much seeing associations above 1.5 for all the individual conditions, slightly below 1.5, quintile 5 versus quintile 1 for both SOFI and census. And SOFI also, 3 waves it might have been, they measured individual level material deprivation. They asked the certain things that households lacked, running it via a questionnaire. And again, we're seeing associations that are largely above the 1.5 mark when you compare the highest group versus the lowest group, and for some conditions are quite substantially higher than that. So it does seem like deprivation has a stronger association with poverty, and this has been seen again with the New Zealand Poverty Monitor, than income poverty seems to do. So I know I rushed through that relatively quickly, but I wanted to leave some time for questions. So conclusions from this, and we've got a couple of papers out and being considered for publication now, is that income poverty is weakly at best associated with child hospitalizations, and we didn't find any evidence of a causal association. Does that suggest that intervening on income is a waste of time? Well, I wouldn't jump to that conclusion so much, because I go back to where we started with this. We were limited to some extent, and LSAC as well in Australia was limited to some extent in the types of measures that they're able to look at. And are hospitalizations the best measure here? There may be some service use biases in who goes to hospital for the same level of severity of condition. And maybe that's washing across some of the things that we'd like to look at. And it also points to a point I like to make whenever I present about the IDI, about the limits of admin data. It's good for some things, but it is an admin record of contacts with services, and you just have to remember that when you're interpreting your answers. We did find strong associations with deprivation methods. So if it was true that intervening on income is a waste of time, then intervening on deprivation may be okay. We don't have the same longitudinal run there to do the causal analyses of that. And ultimately, we weren't left with anything we're able to mediate, because we're getting such small associations that really it was too small to have any detection of mediating factors. So we've convinced ourselves after 2.5 years of trying that we really can't do the main thing that we wanted to do with this, which is look at the factors that you could intervene on that may have an impact on children's lives. So yeah, and this, to some extent, it fits with the systematic review I mentioned at the beginning, that failed to find strong associations or robust associations with poverty measures and health outcome measures. And that's what we're finding as well. And wherever we look, we're finding the same thing, suggesting that to us, it might be real. So thanks very much. That's what I had to say. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
It's absolutely fascinating. It's something sort of staggering research I've seen in a while. Really, and so I'm just curious to know whether, like, what is the explanation? Is it sort of the weaknesses and the sort of, or is it just that you know, received wisdom that income poverty is bad for your health? Is that just wrong?
The short answer to your question is we don't know for sure. And I do stress this, we've only been able to look at a narrow range of health outcomes. I have we did investigate the Pacific Islands family studies, but they didn't quite have the right either income or deprivation measures. We're toying with, we have to give up at some point. We're toying with the idea of looking at the Growing Up in New Zealand study, but even they were showing relatively weak associations between even material deprivation early on. The associations there with the material deprivation were stronger with the mother measures and with the child measures. I suspect that if you were to do this well with self-reported health measures and other objective reported health measures that you're not relying on administrative data sets for, you will be finding something, but not where we're looking. So I don't want to jump to the conclusion that income poverty doesn't matter, and that if you give people, and also we also focus on health. There has been other evidence that if you give cash transfers to families, it does improve children's education, for instance. So we're focused specifically on health here, but I don't want to jump to that conclusion. But what I did want to do is try as hard as we could to see if we could find it with the data that we had available to us, which is why we jumped to the tax records and jumped to census and jumped to LSAC to say, isn't something funny about the initial data we looked at? And I don't think it is. I think it's the measures that we've got don't seem to be sensitive to income poverty changes.
Service use bias. There are some types of health conditions that shouldn't have that sort of bias. Fractures, most sorts of fractures, people arguing about the hospital.
Yeah.
Maybe you're probably not looking for extra analysis to do on the
we could do. There are low base rates of everything, I suppose one of the issues here, but even with any hospitalization, we're not seeing much. And we're seeing probably the lowest effects, actually. So, we're not going to break it out into any different types of hospitalizations beyond that. We did say we'd look at health costs, which we still need to do, actually. But the health costs, again, will be purely based on hospitalization. So why would we expect to see anything? Because you don't have the costs from pharmaceuticals in that early yet. Were things rosier in the early 2000s? I mean, I just don't think so, but I mean, it's a possibility that maybe things are different now. What I've looked at in Growing Up in New Zealand from the reports don't seem to be showing associations that are that much greater. But you're right, it's, we were surprised, which is why we kept looking and digging.
I'm quite interested in those graphs you were showing where you were thinking you were going to see like an upturn on the left for all the various conditions.
Yeah.
But you were pointing out how you see around about the 60% mark and sort of kind of drops off of that. So I was kind of wondering if is it possible then maybe you just have not quite the right idea of what poverty actually looks like? Or have we set our threshold too low in that regard?
Yeah.
Just think in terms of like income equality over like time, like wider and wider and wider.
Yeah.
So like the poverty line is way too low.
Possibly, but again, I still would have expected if you're at the 0 or 1st percentile mark, to be different to someone at the 60th percentile mark, and you're just not. It's like once you get below a certain level of wealth, shall we call it, doesn't matter. You know, whereas the theoretical idea is you need income to buy the things that support healthy living and thriving and well-being and those sorts of things. That doesn't seem to be the case with what these graphs are showing. But it's fascinating that it seems to be, I mean the curves aren't exactly the same as each other, but I think they're showing the same pattern, right?
It makes me wonder if social income or the previous really push you into that sort of very comfortable living.
I mean, you could be right. It's like they all have as much disposable income as each other, which is zero, you know, and above that you've got a bit to spend, possibly.
Were any of the associations stronger for the 0 to 4 age group?
Not really, and that was the thing. If anything, I'll probably go to them again. No, that's this one. Look at it. No, I mean, when I looked at it, I thought it seemed like if anything, the 5 to 10s. Actually, it's a mix, but it's certainly not the 0 to 4s. If anything, it's older. And again, these conditions are most prevalent in 0 to 2s. So we're seeing associations when the outcomes are at their most rare, which is why when we see it at all, we see a sort of wide confidence interval.
I wonder if it could be affected by the income drop-off at birth. So, you know, people who are quite comfortable on 2 incomes drop down to that, you know, 1 income. We've seen another data sets where you have that income drop off, and I wonder if that potentially pushes people into that 60th, you know, the poverty range that might not be in there generally because there are other supports and things in place, and you know they you know come to the child getting, you know, the children getting older than they're actually.
Right, so you think we might have some relatively well-to-do, for want of a better term, people in our lower group for that reason. Having said that, this is, I mean, we are seeing it across the age group, and I suppose the other thing I probably didn't point out about the SOFI data set is you've got a family, you've got children of any age in there, and we just followed them throughout childhood when we could. So it's not as if we started with a birth cohort and followed them for 8 years. We followed them from whatever their starting age was for as long as we could. And children might have been born into the study and were born into the study as well. So I don't think it can be specifically what happens just after birth type effect, but that's a good point though.
I mean, it seems to be you know, a fairly strong indicator that deprivation is more than just income.
Yeah. We are seeing
and that's why we've got these deprivation indices that rely on more than just income. You know,
yeah, and
it's a wide range of factors that contribute to people living circumstances.
yeah. So I'll probably take, I know I'm overrunning, but I'm overrunning myself, so I suppose I shouldn't mind too much. Maybe a question there, how many on?
About
One on, okay. So question.
have you got this broken down by ethnicity?
We have, as part of the proposal, we wanted to look specifically at Māori, and Nicola did that briefly, but we need to come back to doing that. But to cut a long story short, we're showing pretty much the same associations with Māori. I haven't looked at other ethnic groups specifically. But what we did see is nothing different from what I'm showing you now, the same sort of associations.
Yeah, I was just also wondering about what would be long-term associations of having experienced fertility. Because this is, you know, that hospitalisation that we say is a very limited measure.
Yeah.
So what about in the longer term, when the children and adults in their later years, what those longer term measures might be? In that study you mentioned earlier, whether that's going to be
Well, that's something we can do because we've got our study starting in 2002, and some of those children were in their teens then. So we've got hospitalisation data, in theory, up till 2019, I think now. So we could actually look at that longer term. We're honing in on short-term changes as much to look at whether there's a causal association or not. But it is a question of, it is an interesting question whether this experience during childhood, even if it doesn't impact your health then, does it impact your longer term health? And we can look at that, you're right.